I made a complete list of all the specialty tools you need to bleed the Fox Float X, and they're linked in the description, and here they are right here. The service procedure for the Bomber Air and the Float X are virtually identical, so if you see me working on one and then the other one, remember they're both the same. If you apply the techniques I'm about to show you, you can bleed this shock at home, but I'm not gonna lie, it was really challenging and it completely wiped me out the first day. Make sure the shock is clean and let all of the air out of the shock. If you let the air out too fast, the stanchion will scrunch up into the shock because of the large negative air chamber. At this point, if it looks like this, it's extremely dangerous and do not open the shock. You need to start over, put the Schrader valve back in and pump it back up. You need to slowly release the air in little chunks at a time and make sure the stanchion stays extended out. If your Fox Float X or Marzochi shock has been opened before, you can untwist it by hand, the outer air can, to remove it from the damper assembly. If the shock has never been opened before, it can be extremely tight and you're gonna need a strap wrench. The strap wrench goes around the main body and then you tighten it up. If it doesn't loosen, you just flip the strap wrench around in the other direction. So we have a very important step right here. On the IFP, we need to remove the dust cap with the Schrader valve tool. And then we need to physically remove the Schrader valve from the piggyback. Because there's 150 PSI of air behind here, effectively making pressurized oil inside of the shock. Pressurized oil is super dangerous, so do not forget this step. Once we get that Schrader valve out, push the dust cover down with your fingers, and then you're going to remove the ring that holds the dust cover in place. You can do this with your fingernails. I used a pick. So there is an internal floating piston in the piggyback, but leave it there, because first thing we got to do is go back to the main part of the shock. On top of the seal head, there's two tiny little torque bits holding travel reducers or just this simple little washer inside of the shock. This is a little bit challenging because there's not much clearance to get your torque bit in there. Once the washer can slide up, we can put our specialty pin spanner on the top of the seal head. Place the shock in a vise. You could awkwardly do this on the bench if you wanted to. We're going to take that specialty pin spanner, the knockoff Chinese one, and we're going to slot it into the upper seal head of the shock. This one is pretty easy to get loose because we have a lot of leverage to push against the shock. After the seal head is removed, you basically have this shock gutted. Be careful because the oil gets really messy and trapped inside of the shock because it has small little passages. Now it's completely up to you. If you want to replace all the O-rings, both these shocks are brand new and I was just making a video looking at the shim stacks. So at this point, I'm basically going to just start putting it back together. If you want to avoid a massive headache, you need to pay attention closely to this bleeding procedure because this shock is very difficult to bleed because it's a smaller shock. The Fox Float X2 is like super easy to bleed because everything is very big. You need 2 syringes and 2 adapters, bleed port adapters. So first we're going to start on the IFP, and sorry the camera's out of focus. So the IFP is inside of the piggyback and there's a tiny little torque bit inside of the IFP. You need to loosen this up and then you need to put it back in hand tight. The main bleed port is on the stanchion, and we're going to repeat that process. We're going to put it back in the stanchion hand tight, and make sure you have 2 loose bits handy because this gets a little bit tricky. With the shock and a vise, you're going to fill the piggyback up with oil all the way to the top. And then you're going to get your IFP. And remember, the bleed port in the IFP is hand tight because we're going to need to open and close that sucker. It's kind of a balancing act to do this, but if you apply these techniques, I promise it works great. So we're going to squeeze the IFP into the piggyback slowly. This will purge air through the main rebound piston on the other side. We're going to take the stanchion and we're going to fill it all the way up to the top. We have a completely full piggyback and completely full stanchion. Slowly push the IFP down, creating a waterfall onto the main seal head. Once the main seal head is basically a puddle of oil, take the stanchion and topple it over and tighten it as quickly as you can. And this is very messy, so put some cardboard underneath you. Flip the shock right side up, put the main seal head pin spanner on there and tighten it up so you do not forget. The main bleed hole on the stanchion. So it does have some specialty threads, but I have a trick for you. This is the IFP fill valve adapter, and it is the same threads. Get a little piece of hose and put it around the threads and zip tie that on. You're going to need 2 syringes here, and make sure they're pretty much all the way full on the syringes, and you need to make some kind of adapter with hoses so everything is airtight. Open the bleed port up on the stanchion and screw the IFP filling valve syringe into that. We're on the main bleed port and we're pushing the syringe down, effectively pushing the IFP up like it's gonna fall out. When we get near the top, we're gonna push the IFP down and that'll fill the syringe up. Special note here, do not pull up on the syringe. If you pull up on the syringe, you'll make fake bubbles. So we can only push down on the syringe. We can only push down on the syringe and push down on the piggyback. There's no pulling up. Once you've done this 5 or 6 times and you're confident there's no bubbles, we need to open up the bleed hole on the IFP. Remember I told you to keep that IFP bleed port hand tight. So we use the Fox Float X2 bleed adapter on another syringe and basically screw it into the IFP and force the IFP down. This will remove the trap bubbles from underneath the IFP. And some bubbles will come out of the other syringe. This is quite the balancing act, and you may need to add or remove oil from the syringes. With both syringes connected, it's basically a game of seesaw. Push one down, push the other one down. Remember to never pull up on the syringe. If you look at the syringe, on the upper right of the screen, I'm running low on oil. You need to be very careful because you can introduce bubbles into the shock. You can get this, but it will take some time and some practice. When you have no bubbles coming out of either syringe, it's time to remove the IFP syringe. So push the IFP up with the other syringe so it's easier to put the bleed screw back in. Once you have that syringe unthreaded, you want to fill the IFP or the piggyback up with oil because we need to push the bleed port into its hole. With a puddle of oil inside the piggyback on top of the IFP, put the bleed screw back in. And you need to use like a long set of needle nose pliers to make sure it's tight. We need to set the IFP depth after the bleed screw is in the IFP. I use a dial caliper. They make all kinds of fancy tools. We just have to measure the lowest part on the IFP. On a most common shock 230 by 60, it's 40 millimeters. It is piggyback dependent and you need to look up the specs for your shock. So basically you push the IFP down with your finger and make sure you measure about 40 millimeters, and this will be the final height for the IFP. At this point we can unscrew the main bleed port, and I'm going to fill it up with a little bit of oil before I put the screw in. It's a good idea to run through and double check all your bleed ports and the main seal head to make sure you didn't forget everything was tight, and don't ask me why I'm telling you that because I forgot to do that. So we have the IFP depth set, so we're going to push the air cover into the piggyback of the shock. So it goes IFP, air cover, and then the spring clip. So at this point I forgot to fully tighten the IFP bleed port because I ran through and double checked everything, so you'll need some long needle nose pliers to reach down to the IFP to tighten the bleed port. Basically the bleeding is done, so we have to recharge the IFP or the piggyback air. It's the same fitting we use for the main bleed port on the Fox Float X. Now the specification to recharge the IFP or the piggyback is 150 psi, but if you read the fine print it says plus or minus 10 psi. If you want a firmer shock, go up to 160, a softer shock 140. A lower IFP pressure does risk cavitating the shock, but it will give you a softer ride. Once the IFP is recharged, you need to dyno test this thing before putting the travel reducers and the little circlips back on the main seal head. So it shouldn't be crunchy throughout the stroke. It does make a weird little noise at bottom out, but that seemed to be normal from the last 3 Float X's I've serviced. So I was bleeding another Float X and it was just as hard. So don't think this is gonna get easier. I don't want you to get super frustrated and spend 2 days on it like me, but if you're up for the challenge, definitely go for it. Now you just have to assemble the air can and put the tokens back in. If you have a bomber air shock, you have to notch the Fox Float X tokens to fit it inside of the shock. Now you gotta watch this video where I went deep on the shim stacks on both the Float X and the bomber to really see what was the difference, because I can tell you they ride. Well, you're gonna have to watch the video.